So welcome to week 6. I realized as I was getting set up that I am in yet another place. I don't think for any of these 6 sessions I've been in the same spot, but I'm back in Ottawa, dog sitting on the unceded Anishinaabe territory that is home to me, and I'm glad to be here. We are picking up on page 52, The Wages of Whiteness. And that is chapter 3 for future listeners. So, The Wages of Whiteness. One of the most influential texts in critical whiteness studies is David Roediger's Wages of Whiteness, Race and the Making of the American Working Class. The wages in the title refers to the racial advantages that American workers of European origins have consistently chosen over broader solidarity with workers of color, particularly Black workers. According to Roediger, the wages of whiteness concept was first articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America. Du Bois sought to explain the failure of poor white Southerners to forge class solidarity with newly freed Black people after the Civil War. The theory of laboring class unity, Du Bois wrote, rests upon the assumption that laborers, despite internal jealousies, will unite because of their opposition to exploitation by the capitalists. This failed to transpire during Reconstruction because of a, quote, carefully planned and slowly evolved method, which drove a wedge between the white and Black workers, end quote. In short, poor whites were bought off with invitations into the poisoned privilege of whiteness. Du Bois explained the method. And this is a long quote. It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their votes selected public officials, and while this had small effect on the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown to them. White schoolhouses were the best in the community. The newspapers specialized on news that flattered the poor whites and almost utterly ignored the Negro, except in crime and ridicule. And that's the end of that passage, or that excerpt. In The Wages of Whiteness, Roediger elaborates that on the public and psychological wage named by Du Bois, particularly on the willingness of poor whites in the antebellum North to pursue it when that choice hasn't always been in their long-term economic interests. Like Du Bois, Roediger sees white supremacy as a profound and long-standing barrier to the working class coalition needed to redistribute wealth and more fundamentally transform American capitalism. Roediger identifies as a Marxist, but doesn't think that Marxism historically explains why so many workers define themselves as white. While there are clear material benefits to whiteness, white family wealth is roughly 10 times that of Black family wealth, Roediger doesn't think that these advantages alone explain attachments to whiteness, especially when poor whites likely perpetuate their economic disadvantage by consistently choosing racial over class solidarity. I'm going to pause there because the dog wants to come in, but also I'm thinking about how, two things. One, I've had this conversation with others before, but I'm saying this as a Canadian, and we have a mix of Canadians and Americans here, but it is confusing at times to us why things are the way they are in the US, if I can speak for all Canadians. But there's this idea of aspirational wealth in the US that I think we don't really have that in Canada. And so even if you're poor, you're on the verge of, like that wealth is going to come. And it's why there isn't the same understanding that, hey, we should help each other out, that we should unite together and in solidarity work to make change. But the other thing I'm thinking about as I read that passage is how much that's still the same. Like, if you look at ICE, it's all white dudes, that they are reaching out to, I'm assuming, so this is a question as much as a statement, but are we still reaching out to disenfranchised young white men and offering them a place at the table? And is that where the willingness to, to oppress others is because, like, this is my chance? And, I mean, this is about the antebellum South, but like, it's still happening, it seems. So some thoughts, and turn it over to you while I let the dog in.
But even how would we know that they're white? Because they're all have balaclavas on. They're completely masked. I mean, they probably are mostly white or all white. I don't know. But I mean, that's part of it's horrifying to begin with. But the fact that they're trying to basically they're just saying that this is normal. We have completely, covered law enforcement, quote, people doing this. I mean, it's like if it was in a movie, you'd be like, that would never happen. I don't even know.
Well, that comment, or that one bit from Dubois, that the police were drawn from their ranks and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. And I felt like, is this 2025 we're talking about?
Yeah. I think I saw a couple of reels where it seemed to me that some of the people rounding up others were Black.
Okay.
But who's getting targeted? The majority of the people in the United States are brown. And I'm seeing this, I mean, certainly, I think in some, I would say the majority are, I just think Proud Boys, white, just, if they didn't have their KKK outfits on, they'd be, they've sort of traded that for the other kind of mask. But I do think that they're really primarily going after people that look like they're aliens. I mean, that's the name they use. And I don't think that it's harder to identify they from the Black population who might be that have been here for many generations versus people that might have come from nations now that are primarily Black. It's harder to decipher. And so they're really focusing on people that look like they're coming from South America and Mexico. Mm. And I haven't heard of many Asians being rounded up.
I haven't seen any in any of the coverages. I've never seen a white person. They are almost all Hispanic, not even Black.
Right.
They're almost all Hispanic.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't remember in all the press coverage I've seen, not seeing an Asian, not seeing somebody who was white, not seeing even someone who is like Indian from India, like only Hispanic. I don't know. That's probably not true, but I don't know. I can't even imagine I don't know, has any of you seen anyone white being wrangled by these people?
Not white, but I have for sure seen folks that seem to be Middle Eastern in origin also.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I just wonder if that this is similar as being described here between white population and the Black population is now somehow in this instance allowing Blacks to have more privilege than Browns. I mean, I think that's obvious at this point. I don't know. Or different ways of oppression, different ways of punishment, and because there's, I mean, that's continual. But this Hispanic roundup is new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Kelly, I don't know if this is what you meant, but you're talking about the American aspirational
Aspirationally
way of,
wealthy. Yeah.
yeah, and power is like I grew up going, well, anybody can be president, you know, that kind of thing. And it's like, just, well, just work hard and you'll get there. And it's all me, myself, and I, with all individuality, it's all, you know, your own independently, how much effort you put into it. There's the cooperation element is not even considered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what was on my mind, that is this the distorted fruit of the American dream, that you know, one of the consequences is that you will not have solidarity or real community, because this focus on the individual, and that's it. Like, if you just work hard enough, you'll have your own private jet too.
I want to add to what you guys are saying because I'm assuming, do you all know Shark Tank?
Mm-hmm.
The show
Mhm.
Shark Tank, and Mr. Wonderful. Everybody knows Kevin O'Leary is Mr. Wonderful. Okay. And he is, you know, he owns 50 companies. Who knows how successful he is, but you know, I follow him to kind of keep a tab on the entrepreneurial world, and also he's always on Fox News, so I like to keep a like what's going on over there. And a lot of the stuff he just attributes to noise about what Trump is doing. And then, but what he just said was the number one export or import we have in import or export in the America is the American dream,
Mm-hmm.
which for him, clearly, he's like, you know, you cannot mess with that because there is no other country in the world who has the kind of, you know, incredible vision of American dream than America. And he was very, although he's clearly a Trumper, he's clearly was very adamant about how that was a big mistake, which I was glad to hear, because forget about all the other stuff we can say, you know, everything kind of seems to rest on that with Trump.
Mm.
And it's so true. I mean, it completely, you know, have you all seen on social media the different quotes from like Reagan and, you know, Bush, and the one thing they all say is that, you know, we are a country of immigrants. That's what makes us unique. We are all immigrants. So how Trump gets away with all this and everybody who follows him is a total mystery to me. His mother, I just saw her, she's Scottish. She's like had
Scottish.
descent.
Mm-hmm.
She, his wife, I mean, like, it's
Mhm.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Logic is not one of the tools. Yeah.
So one of the things that, okay, there's two things I was thinking of, and going back to the aspirational and cooperative cooperation and unity. I'm thinking about how unions, the development of unions in America have done countered that somewhat. It's given protection, but boy, that is, you know, it's always under fire. It's always under, and it's way, way diminished from what it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was also thinking about what you were saying, Kathleen, about the American, or somebody was saying about the American dream, and thinking about what brings people into the country is that individual idea is that if I can get here, if I can get there, I can find enough work to send money home. And that's, and my understanding is that happens all the time. I mean, that's it. They aren't accumulating wealth. Who are they? I feel it's weird for me to think I mean, to put everybody in this big pot, but many people, they come here and they work hard and they send their money back from where they came.
Yeah, but that's also a complaint, because they're
Oh, yeah.
taking money and then they're giving it back, and so it's not circulating in the American economy. So that's a one of the big complaints.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, welcome to Walmart.
Right.
Welcome. Well,
What the corporations certainly do, and hollow out communities. Kat has made note that she's in Australia and she's describing what's beginning to feel like Gilead, The Handmaid's Tale. Walls and surveillance replacing trust and community. And then she notes federalized troops overriding state sovereignty, policing policy by decree, not deliberation, narrative control, where dissent becomes anarchy. Great example, the No Kings March this weekend were labeled the We Hate America March by the right. And Kat also says, Margaret Atwood, the author, famously said she didn't invent anything in Gilead. She just rearranged real historical precedents. What's happening now feels like a remix of those same ingredients: fear, control, and the slow normalization of the unthinkable. Yeah, and I do, you know, I mean, I think the labor movement in an increasingly secular society might be the one thing that could help people to come together. And it's also where, you know, there's a good segue back to the book, because this idea of how do we come together effectively, like what is needed for these movements to be successful. I'll go back to reading. In his recent book, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland, sociologist Jonathan Metzl develops an argument about the current conjuncture that is supportive of Roediger's historical research in Wages of Whiteness. Metzl explains how, on the issues of gun control, healthcare, and school reform, lower and middle-class whites regularly choose a white backlash politics that gives them the sensation of winning, but actually dampens their health and economic prospects. Drawing on focus group research, he finds, for example, that significant opposition to Obamacare, even among those who benefit from it both economically and physically, is rooted in an unwillingness to have personal tax dollars used to improve other people's lives, particularly racialized people. Metzl doesn't deny the real advantages of whiteness, such as not being disproportionately shot by police, deported, or mass incarcerated. But, following Roediger, he argues that white supremacy ironically harms the aggregate well-being of U.S. whites as a demographic group. I think that's a really important piece, that white supremacy hurts white people. And that's not, you know, the main reason we should dismantle it, but, you know, we actually don't gain from this kind of oppression. Because Marxism can't explain the historical attraction to whiteness among American workers of European descent, Roediger turned to thinkers in the Black radical tradition, such as Du Bois and Baldwin. Drawing on these thinkers, he builds an analysis of white wages as salves in the face of abiding status anxieties generated by capitalist development. He writes that the, quote, status and privileges conferred by race could be used to make up for alienating and exploitative class relationships, North and South. White workers could, and did, define and accept their class positions by fashioning identities as, quote, not slaves and as, quote, not blacks. End of the excerpt. While American elites peddled whiteness strategically to divide the working class, workers themselves were magnetized by the offer. The practical application of this point is that targeting elites, while crucial, won't undo white supremacy. Anti-racism work needs to happen within social movements and the broader society to address white supremacy's demand side and build a working class coalition strong enough to transform capitalism. I'm making note of the fact that, like, this transformation of capitalism as well as racism is that they end up going hand in hand. Roediger's historical analysis of imagined racial superiority as a salve for status anxiety graphs onto Baldwin's analysis of the white American psyche. Like Baldwin, Roediger addresses how both class anxieties and lingering pain about histories of colonial dispossession internal to Europe helped fuel compensatory attachments to white supremacy, but with a particular focus on the antebellum North. It's curious, though, that Roediger chose not to accompany Baldwin to the depths of the white supremacy disaster zone. Why would a close reader such as Roediger ignore Baldwin's death denial thesis? I suspect that Baldwin's existential account of whiteness is too distant from even Roediger's reformulated Marxism. Since the publication of Wages of Whiteness, Roediger has been criticized by some Marxists for departing too far from historical materialism and relying too much on generalizing and psychologizing analysis. It's possible that he anticipated these criticisms when he wrote Wages, and thus chose to avoid Baldwin's more existential claims to lessen the weight of critique. I imagine that Marxist critics of Roediger's use of psychoanalysis would say similar things about Baldwin's existential analysis, that he reifies whiteness and produces a generalizing analysis that occludes the possibilities for interrelational solidarity. Like other theorists, Baldwin does sometimes rely on abstractions that don't hold in all times and places. No conceptual analysis does. And yet, given the persistence of white supremacy, Baldwin's death denial thesis deserves more attention than it has received. Moreover, Baldwin is attentive to those who have eschewed whiteness not as a sacrifice, but as a step toward personal and human freedom, whether his teacher, Bill Miller, or the abolitionist, John Brown. Like Roediger, Baldwin sees whiteness as a social construction that can be undone. He encouraged white people to join in the liberation of the blacks, in the cities, in the towns, before the law, and in the mind. He also insisted that white people work alongside other white people to undo white supremacy, both external and internalized, since it was their problem in the first place. For Baldwin, white anti-racism would not only accelerate the undoing of white supremacy, it would quicken the emergence of socialism in America. The price of any real socialism here, he wrote, is the eradication of what we call the race problem. Like Roediger, Baldwin thought that effective challenges to capitalism needed to be anti-racist. But the key to that anti-racist work would be grappling with the facts of life, particularly finitude, if compensatory attachments to fantasies of supremacy were to be cut off at their root. And I'll pause there because I know that's a lot. Thoughts, comments? I'm sort of wondering if, the ignoring or sort of overlooking the death denial thesis, if it's in part because of the fact that so many of us are deeply engaged in that death denial. So like, how can you actually address it if you're trying to maintain the veil of it?
Yeah, I was wondering whether it's not intentionally left out. It's just, it's like when you have blinders, it's not even seen. Like I just thought, I'm not sure it's an intentional exclusion. I just think they slid over it. Yeah, which is what makes Rose kind of taking it all apart in this book so interesting, because it's probably been slid over a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think about it, like in language, for example, and, when people will say something like, well, if I was to die, and, it's that sort of funny, well, if is not part of it, like you're going to. And this, and, I mean, without any, I have lots of tenderness for that. Like we're conditioned to be thinking that way. And so to your point, V, that we don't even notice it. It's so subterranean. I also feel really out of my depth around, like, this is so interesting to me, but I realize I have very little, scholarship, if you will, very little background in some of these thinkers and theories, really, on anti-racism and, sort of cause and effect. And including too, like I know Resmaa Menakem really brought forward for me the first time the idea that this anti-racism work needs to be done. We need to separate blacks and whites, and that work needs to be done independent of each other in those initial stages, because, again, there's so much harm, and it ends up being a space that harm is perpetuated. And those were just things that I'd never thought about. And, that comes from privilege, of course, not having to think about it. But I see that, like it's, although that's where I first heard it, that Baldwin, he also insisted that white people work alongside other white people to undo white supremacy. And so whites working together, since it was their problem in the first place. And, I think the narrative around like inclusivity and being open, and I think currently really value those things and don't recognize that, always being in a state of yes and always being open is actually not a thing to aim towards, that actually sometimes having that kind of separation and, I see the trickiness of it, because, like if you have gendered spaces, because we're not allowing women to have the same opportunities as men, that's a problem. But if we have gendered spaces because women want to talk about, their experience of domestic violence, like maybe that is an okay thing. And so the discernment around when is it proper and when is it not. And I feel like that's almost not even helpful to say, but I just realize, like, as I'm reading this, I'm like, oh, there's just a lot that I don't know about this.
I don't know if this makes sense, but like, there's such a huge issue about diversity, equity, and inclusion
Mhm.
in the US, and how Trump has tried to just erase that. Like he's tried to erase historical events and all the things. I teach at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and we have to do DEI training. And as a professor, we're at the point where you're afraid to say anything. And like, what are your preferred pronouns? And, you know, he, she, they, and you, while you want to be sensitive to all that, you feel like you're walking on eggshells and almost really afraid to say anything because, so it's like creates this paralysis, you know, so there, again, it's like comes full circle where it's almost like it closes the conversation. Because if you're not woke and you're not this and you're not that, and you know, then all of a sudden you're wrong and it creates all kinds of other problems. So, I mean, I'm for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I also know what it's like to be like, because it's hard to get used to. For example, there's a lot of gender fluid and whatever, to say they to a singular person is hard to get used to, right? When somebody is identifies as non-binary. Anyways, it's a whole other subject.
Yeah, and then, you know, and so what is it to have those places that we can safely unpack some of that, and, you know, learn new ways of being, or, you know, gain that understanding.
Yeah, we have a chief diversity officer or whatever. She, you know, she has African roots, and there were probably 40 of us on a Zoom call like this, and she was leading it. And suddenly she went into this thing about, we learned that dreadlocks is that it goes dreadful because people saw that, you know, people with dreadlocks it was very negative connotation. So you're not supposed to say dreads or dreadlocks. You're just supposed to say locks. Now, that was news to me, and it was even news to African American friends that I have. They're like, never heard that, sure. But then this woman and another woman on the call went into a whole conversation about locks before that was delineated clearly. So I'm like on my phone being like, locks, like, what is locks? Like, you know, and then I figured they were talking about dreadlocks. But then I said something which was a big risk, you know, in front of 50 or 60 colleagues. And I said, you know, listen, I appreciate that knowledge because I had no idea. But at the same time, when you just went into that conversation about locks, I felt kind of embarrassed because I didn't know what you were talking about. And I looked it up. So in other words, it was sort of a flip the script, you know, so none of it's bad. It's just that there are consequences to all of this sort of hypervigilance. There should be respect, but there has to be some kind of wiggle room. I don't know what else, else to describe it.
Well, I think we end up, you know, again, thinking about the protests that are happening right now, and, you know, some of the critique on social media of, you know, well, this isn't protesting in the right way, and you're protesting the wrong thing, and why are you only showing up now? And I, like, this is again back to the idea of how do we create solidarity? And if we're looking to use information or status or anything as a way of oppressing others or excluding others, then we are perpetuating the trouble and the system that we have. And so, you know, and I think that can look a lot of different ways. And you know, the capitalism extends to knowledge, you know, that we want to hoard what we know and have it as a sort of authority that we can hold over others. And yeah, so I'm saying that, and I'm thinking about all the ways that we've been taught to maintain division.
Right, which in America is getting egregiously worse every second that passes. and talk about hoarding information. I mean, with no shame, Trump is rewriting history in real time, and everyone knows it, and nobody can do anything about it because he's doing everything by proclamation. It is so outrageous, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. It's a big problem. Is anyone else
I just
on the call? Am I the only American?
No, I
the
am.
only American? Who else?
No, I'm in Wisconsin.
Oh, okay. Okay, a couple other Americans. Okay.
And,
I'm not
and
all
I-
by myself.
No, and I just want to say that I have been part of for many years now different anti-racism groups that are white only. And there's a book called Witnessing Whiteness that has been sort of a text for that, which has been really helpful. And it arose spontaneously out of an incident in our neighborhood. We have a neighborhood Facebook group, and somebody was alarmed because there was a young Black kid who this white person thought was suspicious, and they were paranoid, and they put it out there on the Facebook page. And of course, things erupted because we're pretty. I mean, we're a very white neighborhood, but we've got a few Black people, and we've got a lot of Asians, but a lot of people are highly educated university professors and medical hospital workers and everything, and lots of wokeness as well. I would say we're pretty blue right here. It became real apparent that there was going to be some serious divisiveness in the neighborhood if we didn't try to figure out something else. And some people volunteered to lead a group, and it was really great. And there's a number of anti-racism programs in town that are either very inexpensive or free for white people to gather and learn and together and talk about this stuff without doing a lot of damage that I've also seen in groups that have been led by white people who wanted to bring in people of color, and it got really dicey very quickly. So I highly recommend, encouraging that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, and not just facing up to the reality of death.
I could share one other thing on that subject. Again, teaching. I was teaching at Parsons, and there's a lot of many majority foreigners. So a lot of Chinese and people, English as a second language. So they all had to give presentations in each class, short ones, but some of them had such a language issue. And I found one student got up and was talking about colored people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting there going like, I'm like, oh my God. And then the next person got up and also said something about colored people. And I was like, oh my God. So, in real time, and, there was a diverse group. There was an African-American student. I just said, listen, there seems to be some confusion. English as a second language. You can say people of color, but it is not considered to be politically correct to say colored people. I think it's still okay to say people of color, but I don't even know. But at that time, it was okay to say people of color, and you can't say colored people. But if you're English as a second language, that's a real nuance. So I'm like, I said, I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying for those of you who are ESL or whatever. And so, there was the African-American student, came up afterwards and said, thank you, because she was like, you can't just let that go. It's a teachable moment, but also addressing it is tricky. And then I was interviewed, that student had me interviewed by some sort of, it's the New School for Social Research. So it's supposed to be very, progressive. So they asked about this incident and I spoke to them. And then the senior person above me, I got in big trouble
Oh,
for even recounting the event, which to me, there's nothing wrong with it. I have no clue why. I got in, I really got reprimanded. So I don't know what to say, but there it is.
I've been in gatherings that have been, the undercurrent has been whites being afraid of people of color, I'm going to use that, coming into what they think is their neighborhood. In an institution. Okay, so primarily white, highly educated, upper middle class neighborhood. A school the population changed so that the school got repurposed into another function by the school district for a long time, and then that went away, and an alternative school primarily for kids, high-risk kids, the majority Black students, were going to be coming into the neighborhood. And this was a big, big fear. I mean, it's like, not in my backyard, this isn't going to happen. And so there were a number of neighborhood meetings about this. And there was an older woman that used exactly the same terms, used colored people. And the woman who was facilitating did a lovely job. I mean, she herself is Middle Eastern, and she did use it as an educational moment. I saw her physically recoil, and I know that she wanted to criticize the person, but she tried to explain it, and the woman didn't understand. She was probably in her 80s or mid 80s, and she just didn't get it at all. But like you said, other people were very grateful, and I think, I don't know, these terms. I mean, I've been in many organizations where when the first inklings of using pronouns, I guess, Kelly, you've got yours up there. I used to, and there were people who were my age going, I can't do that. I'm not going to say she, her, or whatever. I'm just not going to do that. These white women who were really cool women, really beautiful people, but they just couldn't do it. And I do admit that the only way I've been able to really switch and feel comfortable with they and them is because I've immersed myself into an alternative high school where I would say 90% of the population is non-binary. And it's just like, I do go with they, them, rather than trying to figure out in some cases unless I have a chance to ask. But it's tough. And I just think that we got to cut people some slack for learning this.
yeah. And I mean, my experience has been when there's, genuine good intent, it can be mostly fine. Like I think it's received as like, oh, it's just a mistake. I think sometimes the policing that a person who isn't even affected, that again is recapitulating this kind of oppression. But I also think, both of your examples are describing why anti-racism work, for any marginalized group, to always expect the marginalized community to take on the work of education and correction is really an unfair burden. And so, it behooves us to be helping each other with, pronouns or terminology or what have you, and not asking the group that is most harmed by these things to then also have to deal with the repair.
I want to add one thing that I think is, we're not thinking about it too much, but here in New York, there's a very large Jewish population. And I am living in Terrytown, right across the river is Nyack, and there is a lot of very Hasidic, very conservative Orthodox Jewish people are coming and trying to buy a lot of land and trying to buy a lot of houses and basically, join the community. And there has been a huge backlash by, everyone, like white people, trying to stop it because they are, there is a reputation for if the Orthodox community comes in, they basically take over. And then, you can't just have a balanced like community. But I really, even somebody who I'm friends with who's talking about this, her father's Jewish, and she's saying these things, and I'm like, I don't even know what to say because I'm just sort of like, I don't know what to say because it's, they're not black, they're not brown, they're not Chinese, they're not Asian, they're Jewish. So that's like a whole other thing, that's still a big thing.
Yeah, that oppression shows up in lots of different ways.
And it's 2025 and it's just shocking.
Yeah. Well, let's see if there's any solutions here. While critical whiteness scholars have mostly sidestepped Baldwin's existential analysis of white supremacy, research in social psychology supports it. There is a growing subfield, terror management theory, that examines the effects death awareness has on human behavior. See Chapter 5 for a fuller discussion of terror management theory. Terror management experiments typically prime a test group on their mortality, either with explicit or subliminal reminders of death, and then track how participants respond to different situations or written statements. Numerous studies have found that death reminders typically increase participant identification with and pride in one's in-group. A 2001 study, for example, sought to test if white participants reminded of their mortality would exhibit higher levels of white pride. Hypothesizing that overt white pride would be uncommon among whites in a post-civil rights era where racism is generally understood to be morally bad, the study sought to assess how white people would react to written statements from other whites expressing white pride or outright discrimination against racialized peoples. The researchers suspected that white participants reminded of their mortality would become more sympathetic to fellow whites who demonstrated racial pride. And that is precisely what they found. As the researchers concluded, while most white Americans do not explicitly espouse a connection with or liking for white supremacists, they may, as a result of their terror management needs, nevertheless be sufficiently sympathetic to allow those ideologies to thrive. Avowed white nationalists.
Kelly?
Yep.
I'm sorry, can I just
Yeah, please.
say one of the things that I forgot to mention about that neighborhood gathering? It was very clear to me that everybody there was afraid that they were going to be harmed by these Black students, that they were being reminded of their mortality. And they rose up to push back as a result, because the fear, I mean, it was, the unconscious bias rising up into consciousness. It was amazing. But just the total fear. It was like talk of guns and talk of, just seeing Black kids walking in their neighborhood. People are closing their doors and closing and locking their doors and calling the police. So their fear of death is bringing this incredible white supremacy to the surface.
Yeah, and so misplaced, like so irrational.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of, yeah. And Kathleen has added an article from Psychology Today that nearly everyone fears death, How that fear influences human thinking and behavior is the focus of terror management theory research. According to TMT, death anxiety drives people to adopt worldviews that protect self-esteem, worthiness, and sustainability, and allow them to believe that they play an important role in a meaningful world. Some of these views lead to troubling actions. Absolutely. And that fear, it doesn't have to be necessarily physical death. Social death can be part of it.
Mhm.
This
Oh
is how
yeah,
it's
my
really,
property
yeah,
value is going to go down.
yeah. It's it does show up in some uh, uh, yeah, sort of surprising ways that it can present. Avowed white nationalism is distinct from the more implicit and often subconscious attachments to white supremacy that Baldwin encountered, whether in Los Angeles or Birmingham. I think that's an important point. Like a lot of times people will say, well, I'm not racist. And that we think of white nationalism or the KKK, but the reality is that implicit or these kind of subconscious beliefs that we carry, and it's, if instead of being full of sort of self-loathing about it, if we just kind of recognize that these are things that we've learned or been taught, and we can unlearn them as well, might be a better approach. And yet, as TMT researchers argue, the latter enables the former. So subconscious attachments to white supremacy is what allows for white nationalism. Baldwin saw death denial in both conscious and subconscious manifestations of white supremacy. Returning to his existential analyses of race is especially important in the current conjuncture, when avowed white extinction anxiety is helping to fuel anti-immigrant sentiment and violence. The existential question, writes conservative political commentator Pat Buchanan in a recent blog post, is, quote, how does the West, America included, stop the flood tide of migrants before it alters forever the political and demographic character of our nations and our civilization, end quote. The discourse of white extinction anxiety emerging from the far right, where subtext is often moved into text, highlights the existential foundations of white supremacy. For example, the white man who killed 10 people in Buffalo, New York in May 2022 was a proponent of white replacement theory, a specific form of white extinction anxiety. He claimed that elites, often figured as Jewish or as controlled by Jewish people, were orchestrating demographic changes to disempower white people. The theory is gaining mainstream acceptance. Fox News personalities and Republican politicians such as Matt Gaetz amplify the message to grow their audiences. According to the Associated Press, 1/3 of Americans now subscribe to this theory. I think that's very much the example that you shared, Kathleen, that, the replacement may not just be in terms of death, but like physical space that another group might take over.
Yeah.
Writing even more before the Supreme Court's intentions regarding Roe versus Wade were leaked, writer Carla Bell linked white extinction anxiety to the recent upturn in state-level anti-abortion laws. For Bell, there appears to be a strong correlation between demographic projections, the fear of white genetic annihilation, and the recent wave of abortion bills. Regaining control over women's bodies is of additional importance to constituencies on the political right, according to Bell, because of the central role those bodies play in the war against extinction. Unresolved existential anxieties continue to shape doctrines and practices of racial superiority and male supremacy, as covered in Chapter 6. In the conclusion to the TMT study, the researchers note that the possibility, quote, the possibility that we can reduce racist tendencies by helping people cope with their mortality concerns through education, workshops, and therapies that encourage direct confrontation with their fears. I'm going to say that again because I think that's really key. That in the conclusion of the study, the researchers note that, quote, note the possibility that we can reduce racist tendencies by helping people cope with their mortality concerns through education, workshops, and therapies that encourage direct confrontation with their fears. End quote. This conclusion aligns with the implications of Baldwin's existential analysis of whiteness. Helping people to face the fact of finitude will not by itself undo white supremacy, but it can play an important and overlooked role in limiting compensatory attachments to supremacy. I'm interested in the potential of anti-racist training for left social movements or institutions affiliated with those movements, unions, nonprofits, some university programs, cooperatives, political parties. There's a growing concern on the political left that corporate anti-racism training ends up maintaining class and race hierarchies. Like Baldwin, I think effective anti-racist struggle needs to be anti-capitalist, and that effective anti-capitalist struggle needs to be anti-racist. Also, like Baldwin, I think these axes of struggle can be strengthened by attentiveness to the existential drivers of domination. One important role social movements play is prefiguring new social relations, transforming the effects of death denial in social movements could make them more cohesive. It would also be an important step toward forging genuinely life-affirming cultures in the political mainstream. I find, the examples that were shared tonight by Karen, Kathleen, I think those are good examples of, because I'm sure most of us feel like, I'm a good person, I'm not racist, I'm not misogynistic or, any of these things. But when we start digging into particular examples and how those examples are framed, I'm not racist, but, and then fill in the blank. And to then sort of step back and wonder, like, well, what's undergirding that belief? Where did we get that idea from? Why are we encouraged to think that way? And, it's not necessarily for me, I'm expressing an opinion, that it's not that, again, we need to get into self-flagellation of like, oh my God, I actually am a racist, as much as, recognizing all of the ways it can be expressed and how we might be complicit, and then to be able to direct our attentions to being anti-racist, and not just an ally, but to be actually dismantling. And I really appreciate this idea that anti-racist struggle needs to be coupled with anti-capitalist struggles.
Something that comes to mind, another example outside of the Black and brown population in Middle Eastern, again, because I'm teaching in fashion at FIT and Parsons, there's a lot of Chinese, mainland Chinese students. And because, first of all, so much talent, but there's also however many billions of Chinese, the population is so huge. And, the number one thing for Chinese families is education, like to get the best education. They want you to go to Harvard, they want you to go to Princeton, they want you to go to Parsons, they want you to go to like the best schools. So consequently, there is a large population of, Chinese students, and I was doing portfolio reviews. And so it became a really strange thing, which was kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, but I'll tell you what it was, is that we had to make sure there was a balance across, that there was real diversity, because it could have been, when I first came into the program, out of 30 students, at least 20 were from mainland China. There's nothing wrong with that, but it doesn't provide the kind of, diversity that usually helps, I think, in an educational situation. But then the choices weren't just merit-based. Then it became, where are you from? And it was, racial in a way, because we need Americans, we need this, we need that, and I was a little weirded out by that, but I don't know what's right or what's wrong. I don't know. I mean, there is argument to have a diverse, if everybody's Chinese or everybody's American, it's not going to be a very interesting cohort because it's very one-sided, right? And frankly, we were struggling to find American students that were qualified enough. So anyways, for whatever that means, I just don't want to say, it's like there's all kinds of weirdness in different sectors and for different decisions, and you don't really know what to do.
But I think that's a great example because, if it was a class of 28 white students and 2 people of color, there wouldn't be a like, oh, we need to really, work on this. There's a problem. It tends to be when whiteness is in the minority that we notice. And Kat has added, we are all conditioned by our environment, parents, authorities, peers, culture. Until an individual actively, ongoingly audits their conditioning and weeds out the crud, it's not possible to make the claim of being non-racist. Yeah, I would agree with that. And not because of any, sort of, malevolence. We just don't notice. It's the water that we swim in, and we need to be able to sort of step outside of ourselves and look back to have that kind of objectivity. And even in doing that, it might need to be pointed out to us.
I don't know if I mentioned this last week when I was in New Orleans. I don't think I did, but so stop me if I did. But I made a new friend, and she's indigenous or Native American or First Nations, however. Her husband, I don't know what his ethnic background is, but he was a naval officer for 27 years. We were talking about so many things that night, but I asked her what was his, what did they think of Trump's invitation of all the generals and admirals? And, some of the things that Hegseth said about we're not going to be woke anymore, and we're going to, get rid of anyone who's not male or female and all that stuff. And I got an inkling of, she basically said that there are so many layers of what's going on about what the military, how that is how people are so dependent on each other in the military and on all kinds of rules and regulations, that now that there are transsexual, what she was saying was the woke thing is an issue for them, because people are seeing that transsexual medical care is, again, replacing or taking precedence over, and they're looking at that as being elective rather than necessary. That medical care is replacing or eliminating opportunities for people who really need it. Children of, it's like there isn't a need yet. That population is still it's an elective. It's more superficial or something. I'm not being articulate in this at all. But it was just a really interesting thing that is kind of like, well, everybody accepts everybody, except they're taking this critical stuff away from us. We have to wait for medical care because these people are now allowed to get medical care, and they're actually getting priority over what used to be something else. And so I'm just seeing how these different populations, these different awarenesses of what people's needs are, of who people are, when they are recognized and given, the system builds in ways to protect them and to serve them, that is a threat to existing populations. That, and it's like, how do you, but wait a minute, it was a threat to these other people that they were excluded. Why are you thinking this is a threat, but they're now included? And so, Kathleen, what you're saying about it being weird and not knowing what to do, it's like there's just all these different shifts of perspective on who gets what, the limited resources, or perceived limited resources.
I
And
think
that's
there's so much change though happening in general in society, right? There's just so many shifts between the gender fluidity and then all of this political turmoil. And so there's so many moving parts that I think, it's just chaos and people don't know what to do. And people, I think, are kind of afraid to do anything. And then people tend to cling on to what they're familiar with, which may be these, racist or preconceived notions or whatever it is. So it's a tricky time. That's why doing this is so great. I think really helpful. I have to go, folks. I have an 8 o'clock call. So thank you so much. And I'll see you guys.
Kathleen, thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, and I would say I do think that there's a bit of a trope, given that transgender people make up about 1% of the population. It is, this sort of othering, and they're taking resources from us. I really think that that is fomenting fear, and it's always disappointing, especially in a community where there is a sense of like we look out for each other, and to know that, man, even in those spaces, this kind of othering happens.
Mm.
But the idea that like there's this confusion and uncertainty, I'm not sure if it's partly true, but I think it's also partly manufactured. And this is again where a mindfulness practice, the being grounded, can really help us to cut through some of the noise and propaganda, some of the deliberately manufactured turmoil, because that turmoil is being used against us and being used to keep us apart. So I do think that it's why this work is so important and why this book is so important. And I think about my kids who, over and over again, I've learned from, but to see the ease with which they navigate this tells me that, oh, it's not actually hard. It's just, I'm not used to it, or I'm not comfortable. And so, when they so readily talk about their friends and with the they, them, and, they shift in and out of it, no problem. And the one example I'll finish with, and then we can wrap up, I remember my daughter coming home at 13. So this is a long time ago, and saying to me, with a shrug, like, well, if you're not an intersectional feminist, you're automatically racist. And I was like, I don't know what an intersectional feminist is. And so it's totally possible for us to learn. If I can watch my 13-year-old take this in and understand it and then offer it back, we can learn it too. And I'm actually really glad that kids today, of all the burdens that go with the technology that's available to them, it has also given them this understanding that I know I didn't have at the same age, and an ability to communicate with each other. So I'm going to stop the recording. We're finishing up at next week. We'll start with embodied social change on page 57. Looking forward to seeing you all again next week. Thanks, everybody.